Hi ladies, welcome to the third lecture. I hope that the first 2 weeks have been productive and that everything has been helpful so far. I hope nobody's overwhelmed. I'm going to try to keep this lecture a little shorter today, this video a little shorter, because I went a little over on the last one. So today we're going to be talking about teaching piano technique and practicing. So how are you going to deal with teaching little 5-year-olds or 8-year-olds technique at the piano and what that's going to look like? Technique is the practice of good posture, fingering, and pedaling. And it is something that we should be teaching students from the very first lesson. It's not something that they're going to start learning later on. They need to begin learning how to do those three things well in the very beginning. So the skill technique is, well, first I'm going to give you a little bit of a better outline here because it's going to be very, in the past it's been very conceptual and we've been talking about teaching styles and stuff like that, but I'm going to actually give you an outline here. So number one, what is technique? You can go ahead and write that down. Under that, you can put letter A, the skill of performance, not exercises. And letter B, this should begin at the very first lesson. And then number two, we're going to talk about posture. So posture means to obviously, posture obviously promotes good technique. If somebody has poor posture, they're not going to have good technique. And the key is also to stay relaxed. So you can put those two things under number two, which is posture. Number three is fingering. Underneath that, you can put fingering makes technique easier. So a lot of times we associate technique with, well, we're not using the right fingering, but really the technique is playing with our fingertips and having a rounded hand shape. But if we pay attention to what fingers we're using, for instance, if we're playing a C scale, doing 1, 2, 3, tuck under with our thumb, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to, that technique of having a rounded hand shape and playing with our fingertips is going to be a lot easier if we use the proper fingering. For children up to 7 years old, they've been using their fingers for collective reasons. So they're not really used to having individual independence with each of their fingers. And I'm sure you realize this, but it is important to understand that they also don't have the same dexterity that we do. So that's why you'll see a lot of times a little kid you'll try to get them to have a rounded hand shape and they really struggle because their fingers aren't strong enough. So they're not flexible, they're not strong, they're not agile enough. So this has to be acquired over time, the ability for a young child to have proper technique, but you're always reminding them and you're always encouraging them and trying to aim for that. If it's not perfect, you don't want to get upset about it, but you just want to keep reminding them, and as they start playing, they'll get stronger, and then they will develop, with those reminders, develop that good technique. But just remember that with young children, they are not going to be able to have a perfect, hand shape. Avoid placing the thumb on any black key at all. So usually for young beginners, they will start on the black keys. So you'll want to have them use fingers 2, 3, and 4 on those keys. And a lot of times they want to use their thumb because we're really used to using our thumb to grab things, the pincher. But try to remind them, I want you to use 2, 3, and 4. And they should know at that point, they'll start learning their finger numbers by that point. The fourth finger is the weakest finger. Avoid placing this finger on the strong beat. Okay, so your strong beats in 4/4, for instance, is 1 and 3. Your strong beat in 3/4 is 1. Most cases, you're going to be starting with just a standard 4/4 time. Even if they haven't learned a 4/4 time signature yet, they're going to be counting 4 beats per measure. So try to avoid using the forefinger. And most of the time, method books will have the fingering in there. That really helps kids know where their hand is placed. So, but that's just a little helpful thing. That is why a lot of times you will see, like in scales, rarely you ever see your forefinger. Well, I guess on F you use your forefinger on B flat, but most of the time, once you get to your third finger, you're switching. And then some of the flat scales, you are using your forefinger. But anyway, the fifth, so your pinky, shift your weight because this finger will naturally lift upward. So you can do later on when the student gets a little bit more in the elementary level, you can talk to them about pivoting their wrists a little bit. Because obviously your pinky is going to be the shortest finger, so you're not going to be able to reach that. And so a lot of times, especially little kids will stick up their pointer finger because they're straining and they're trying to reach that because their pinky is so weak and also so little. You don't want to write in the fingering all the time because this can become a crutch. So I've said this before, a lot of kids will depend on the fingering to tell them where they are supposed to go. So not necessarily anything wrong with that. That is supposed to help them, but they can start depending on it and actually look at the fingering instead of the notes. And I have even whited out some of the fingering because they look at the number 3 instead of an E, and say they're in a different hand position and they've moved from the C position and they just play their third finger, but it's not the right note. So just something to watch out for. Underneath fingering, use your arm to press into the keys. And this comes, I think, in lesson book 1 in Piano Adventures. So if you have a preschooler, they probably aren't going to be learning arm weight yet, but then a beginner will start to learn how to use their arm weight, and it will explain that to you, how to teach that. And then so we got posture fingering, and then the third technique underneath that is scales, chords, and arpeggios. So we're going to talk about scales, chords, and arpeggios now. Underneath scales, you're playing a scale like a centipede. That's a good way to talk about it to a student. Couperin is in 1716 came up with the first scale fingering. C.P.E. Bach came up with 3 different scale fingering, which one of these is what we use today. So the fingering, I have a link that I can send you if you're looking to teach a student scales, and I can make that available to you. And that actually has the picture of the scale. You probably have seen it before because I use it with all my students, but it has the picture and it shows you the fingering for the scale. So fingering for scales is very important. But we're also trying to achieve other things with learning scales. So scales are definitely important. Underneath scales, chords, and arpeggios, let's talk about chords and arpeggios. So again, chords I believe, should be taught very early on. They're not, something that you finally arrive at once you get older. We still want to work on that. Arpeggios are definitely for a little bit more of an intermediate level. Once they've learned their chords, then from there, all arpeggios are broken chords played fast. So that's another subject in and of itself. And then the last technique is pedaling. Okay, so this is actually probably the least emphasized. Students don't really get into pedaling until a little bit later on. They start learning where the pedal marking is, but they don't really do a lot of pedaling by ear until they get a little bit older. But the teaching of pedaling is largely neglected, unfortunately. I really like to start kids young when they have really accomplished a piece and say they're playing it for a recital or something. I'll say, why don't you use the pedal? And I'll just make it fun for them. And I'll have to explain at that point what each of the pedals are. And that is quite a challenge for a young student to remember. But the Romantic era is the era of the sustaining pedal. So the sustaining pedal wasn't really used in the classical era with Mozart and some of Beethoven. So let's talk about the three pedals just to make sure you guys are aware. So obviously we're used to using the very far right pedal, which is the damper pedal or the sustain pedal. When pressed, the sustain pedal sustains all the dampened strings on the piano by moving all the dampers away from the strings and allowing them to vibrate freely. So all the notes that are being played have a vibration sound, and it will cease naturally, or it will cease when the pedal is released. So I think you can understand if you look at inside of a piano, you'll see the actual damper being removed from the strings, which is pretty cool. Then let's talk about the left pedal. So the far left is the soft pedal. And this pedal shifts the whole action, which is what's the actual part inside of the piano is called. It's called the action. And it shifts everything to the right, which you can actually see this on a grand piano. You can see everything kind of move over. So that the hammers, which normally strike all three strings, so when you strike one note, one key, it's actually striking three. It's striking that note, but it's also striking three strings. So as you hear that note, you can faintly hear two other notes, and it's very faint. You probably won't be able to notice it, but they all harmonize together. But when you use the soft pedal, it is only striking two strings, so naturally it makes everything softer, okay? So as a really complicated way of explaining it, you could just tell a child, this makes it softer, all right? But just so that you're aware of what that is. The middle pedal, this one's not talked about very often, and it's kind of hard to explain. I've seen it demonstrated before. You might want to look on YouTube or something and see how it works for yourself, because explaining it's a little difficult. But the middle pedal is kind of like the sustain pedal. It actually it's called a sostenuto, or sostenuto. Okay, sostenuto, and it actually does mean sustain. But it only sustains the notes that are being held down when the pedal is depressed. So it allows future notes to be played unaffected. So it has kind of an orchestration effect. So if I played a note and the pedal is down, it'll sustain those notes. But then when I release it, when I press the note and I hold it down, it's not sustaining anything. But then when I release it, it sustains those notes, but the future notes are not affected. So anyway, experiment with it. It's actually pretty cool. You'll see this in a little bit more advanced music, but it is abbreviated whenever it's used as SP. Okay, so if you ever come across that, that's helpful to know. So those are your pedals. And we're also going to talk about a couple other things. So we have talked so far about posture, fingering, scales, chords, and arpeggios, pedaling. Now let's move on to rhythm. That's going to be another point. And however you want to outline this, that's fine. I have things outlined in Roman numerals, but however you want to do it is fine. So I'm just giving you the head point, and then you can write stuff underneath it explaining what that is. So underneath rhythm, you can put, it's important to keep the tempo steady. It is important to keep the tempo steady. Think about a heartbeat. We don't want any skips, obviously, in our heartbeat, so we don't want that rhythm to have any skips. Have students, these are just some tips, have students clap it before they play it. That is very helpful to help them understand how the rhythm is supposed to sound, and then they can move on to having to read the notes. Get them to feel a steady pulse. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Especially with children, they may understand rhythm mentally, but not internally, okay? So this is where you have to make it. That's why clapping is helpful, because we're doing that action with our body. Sometimes you can have them stomp, you can have them march, you can have them swing, you can have them dance. Really getting them to feel it is what's important. So sometimes they'll understand how to count something out, but they don't quite get it. For example, I had a student. He's an exceptional student. He's super smart, very mathematic, understands rhythm very well. But he was learning the time signature 6/8, and he was just not able to feel it. So I would count it out with him. I would write in the rhythm for him. He still didn't get it. The only thing that helped was I played the song, and I had him clap on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 while I was playing it, because I wanted him to really start to feel that it's no longer, you can't fit these notes into 4 beats. He was trying to play it in 4/4. You can't fit it in 4 beats anymore. You have to feel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so that's just an example of how you can try to help a student. Now, your beginner students are not going to be learning how to play 6/8. It's usually going to be 4/4 and 3/4. So also play duets with them. That's really going to help their rhythm, keep that steady beat. You can use a metronome. Metronomes are useful. I haven't used them as much just because I feel like I want them to have an innate sense of rhythm instead of something ticking in the background, which some people really like it, and that's totally fine. And I have had to use it at certain points when they are playing too fast and they need to just keep it steady. But for teaching rhythm, it is helpful. I think it is more helpful to just use your body, or clapping or tapping or something like that. But totally a preferential thing. Count out loud. That's helpful. So that pretty much takes care of rhythm. Now let's talk about counting systems. So this is still under rhythm, but this is a different, like letter B under rhythm. Let's talk about the 2 different ways of counting. Beginner students will start counting beats numerically first, okay? This is the number of beats. So if they had, for instance, in a measure 4/4 time, they would have a quarter note, and then a half note. We would count it 1, 1, 1, 2. Okay? Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. This is good for a beginner child, for them to learn the value of notes. So they haven't quite reached the point where they can add up things. They need to learn the individual beats of each, or the individual value of each beat. Then you kind of move slowly to counting. Well, this is still counting numerically, but counting adding up the measures. So quarter note, half note, you would count 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm adding up all the notes there. Then the next counting system would be syllabic or symbolically. This would be counting like using words, or not really words, but there's a system called Kodali. It's spelled Kodali, and that would be using the ta, ta, ta. That's as a quarter note. Ta, ti, would be an 8th note, and so on and so on. You can also use you could use to make up words like walk, running, walk. Or you can make it fun and do apple, pie. Another good one, if you had 4 8th notes all lined up, barred together, you could do huckleberry. Okay, so watermelon. Those are fun for kids. So if they're having a particular hard time with a certain rhythm, make up a fun, saying or something. You could do chocolate for triplets. So those are just some ideas. There's lots of information about that online, and different ideas. I saw this one time that was just full of different full of different ideas like French fries and stuff like that. So anyway, all right, moving on. So we're done with rhythm now. We're moving on to dynamics. So this is the next point. Dynamics make your music beautiful and interesting. So obviously with a song that's played with no dynamics, no variation, then it's just kind of boring. Dynamics, the dynamic level is relative, so definitely my forte is not going to sound the same as a 5-year-old's forte. So keep that in mind. It really depends on how much weight you're putting into the keys. Determine how loud and how soft. So this is a good thing if you're trying to work on dynamics with the students. Ask them, find the loudest part in the song, find the softest part in the song. You can also give examples, like I want you to play this part like a really, really soft purring kitten, or a loud train, or something like that. That really kind of helps them associate music with pictures, which is really good. And you can also do copycat things. So I want you to try to play it just as loud as me and have them copy you. All right, so moving on, we're done with dynamics, moving on to phrasing and articulation. Again, this is all technique. It's a lot of information, I know. Phrasing and articulation would be talking about the phrase line or the legato line, staccato, legato, and accents. And then phrasing as well. So you can write that down underneath phrasing, staccato, legato, phrasing, and accents. So obviously legato means to play it smoothly, like you're walking. Each foot that goes down, a foot goes up, and they go up and down at the same time. Staccato would be short and separated. Accents would be just a punch, a little bit louder than the previous note or the other notes in the measure. And then phrasing would be having a rise and fall in the melody, breathing at the end of a phrase. So kind of having that, holding on to that suspense. So you want to think of the hills and valleys type of a thing. All right, so we're done with piano technique, and I'm trying to rush through this. That is done. We're going to move on to, now this isn't necessarily technique, but I do want to talk about it. Memorization. What is memorization? Memory is the capacity of recall of things learned or experienced in the past. It is the process and discipline by which we may contain this faculty. So it definitely is a not a technique, but it's definitely challenging for some people because that information hasn't been retained. Now, I wouldn't expect necessarily for a young student to have something memorized, but sometimes they've got great memories, and sometimes they're like, I can play it memorized. I can do it without the music, which is awesome. I always congratulate them when they do that, and try to, make those rare occasions, because I do want them to learn how to read music, and even if they know it really well, I still want them to use the music. So memory is the result or the end product of memorization. It is a conscious process and a subconscious process. Conscious memorization is going to be a lot more dependable because it is relying on mental and physical processes such as analyzing. A subconscious process, which means just you've been doing it over and over and over again. Your body is just kind of doing it. It's just a reflex. So it's called reflex memorization. This happens a ton with kids. They think they have something memorized, but they really don't. So it's not reliable. Usually under pressure, they will crumble and forget something. So it's important to have a conscious process when you're approaching memorization. It is a mental process as well as a physical process. So it's not just going through the motions because I've done it 100 times already, but it's actually thinking about it. And it is all three: auditory, visual, and tactile. So they're all very, very important to include that. All right, next thing is improvisation. What is improvisation? It is a response to the lyrical impulses. It is extemporaneous, which means just happening in into real time. Extemporaneous integration of sound. This idea used to be the basis for music making. So when you think about it, really a lot of the classical music that we play nowadays at one point was somebody improvising. They just were able to transcribe it and make it into a piece, and we've been following it for centuries. This idea used to be the basis for music making. I already said that. For example, jazz music, pop music, hymn playing, those are some examples of when improvisation is used. And it is basically just adding to a framework. Sometimes it can be a framework that's in your mind, or it can be a framework that's written out and you're adding things to it. So why do we teach improvisation? Improvisation is the embodiment of rhythm, melody, harmony, and form, the basic elements of music. That quote was given by Dennis Agay. I'm just going to give you these things. This is not going to be tested over, so don't worry about getting this down perfectly. It represents theory. That's what improvisation excuse me, does. It represents theory, composition, and performance, complete musicianship. So when somebody can improvise, it means they have accomplished knowing their theory, they've accomplished knowing how to compose, or at least in the early stages of composing, and they've accomplished knowing how to perform. So improvisation is just a wonderful tool to have. It does take experience, imagination, and some intuition. So I hope you've caught all that. Can improvisation be taught, or is it just somebody just knows how to do it and they have a gift for it? It can be both. Yes, it can be taught. If theory can be taught, and theory is really just a theory, then improvisation can most certainly be taught. All right, so we've got memorization, improvisation. Now let's move on to sight reading. So sight reading is the ability to read and play music at first sight. So the very first time you've ever played something, being able to play it. Sight reading is the ultimate test of note reading ability. Okay, so you really kind of see the raw ability of somebody, or somebody's raw ability of being able to read notes if they're sight reading. So when a student comes to you and says, they sight read something, but they've been practicing it for a week, they're technically not, because they haven't been, they've only just, I'm not saying this right. They have been practicing it, so it's no longer sight reading. So what is going on in your brain? Your eyes see the note. Your hands interpret what you're seeing, both auditory and tactilely. And your hands and fingers respond to the brain's transmission and play the note. So there is a ton going on in your brain when you have to read music. It's very, reading a language, it's basically what it is, except for you have an action that's happening with your body. So there's a lot that's going on. So this is why it's really, really awesome. Music is really awesome. Incorporate sight reading into every lesson if you can. This is key. You definitely don't want to just throw it at them all the time. You need to help them analyze something. You need to help coach them through things. But when a student kind of gets to a point where they are learning the concepts or the notes, then say, hey, I want to give you this song here. You should be able to play these notes based on what you know now. I want you to sight read it. It means they're going to do it on their own. You're not going to coach them through it. You're not going to help them with it. For intermediate students, choose music that is slightly lower than their level. This may help improve them help them improve on their sight reading and be able to recognize those notes faster. So the action of seeing the note and playing it happens faster the more sight reading you do. That is why the only way to get better at sight reading is to do it. All right, so we're getting a little late on the video, so I think I might actually, I have one more thing to go over, and I'm going to separate this into another video. So steps to sight reading. You have to know the title, tempo, key signature of the piece before beginning. Observe the starting hand position. So always, help the student say, okay, what is the first note? It's middle C. What finger do you use? Okay, and help them get to the right hand position, and that will help them. That helps them be able to sight read the notes faster. Be aware of any interesting harmonies or melodic notes. So be kind of aware, okay, is the first two notes, are they stepping or skipping? That's just kind of some questions you can ask them. Read in groups of notes, so help them to read. As they read one note, they're already moving on to the next one, and try to get that, their peripheral vision is basically looking ahead more and more and more instead of reading C. Okay, now E. And just try to get them keep on moving. Always look at the music, not at their hands. Kids are going to look at their hands. I put when it becomes a habit, I put with reminders, and they're still doing it, I put a book over their hand. And when they can play it, which they usually can without looking at their hands, I'm like, see, did you really need to look at your hands? No. Okay, so try to not look at your hands. And some kids have a hard time with it because they really want to, they want to have it perfect. But so it's just something to think about. Play slower than what it says, than what's indicated, but keep a steady beat. So slower is better than playing something da 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 da. So it's like go, stop, go, stop. So you don't want students to learn how to do that. You really need to establish that steady beat. So it's always good to go slower rather than the actual tempo that's indicated. And then they can work up the tempo later. All right, so I'm going to end this video, and then I'm going to go ahead and separate it because it's a little too long to upload this, and I have a little bit more to go over with practicing. So I will see you guys in the next video.